Well, welcome everybody to tonight's talk on soils and soil amendments. And this is actually a really, I think, exciting topic because a healthy garden is going to begin with a healthy soil. So when we get a lot of calls into the extension office with people having problems in their garden, a lot of it has to do with soils. So this class is going to just cover the basics of soil because we only have a little over an hour. So we'll talk about the native soils that you all are dealing with up in Page and how we can amend those soils in order to grow vegetables. So one thing that we're going to have to always remember is that the native soils all over northern Arizona are really good for supporting native plant life, but they're really, really poor for growing food crops and vegetables. So we need to do a lot to help our soils in order to become successful vegetable gardeners. So the first thing that I'm going to do is throw out this really fancy definition of what a soil is. So this is from the NRCS website, and they define soil as the unconsolidated mineral or organic material on the immediate surface of the earth that serves as a natural medium for the growth of plants. But there actually is a lot that's going on in soils. So soils do provide the substrate for plants to grow on, but they also do a lot. And soils are, believe it or not, you can kind of think of soils as like a living system. And there just are a lot of components to soil that makes a soil a soil. So healthy soils give us clean air and water and bountiful crops. So if it wasn't for healthy soils, we wouldn't have our bountiful crops or forests, productive grazing lands, diverse wildlife, and beautiful landscapes. So soil does all of this by performing 5 essential functions. So first, soils help to regulate water. So soils will help control where rain, snow melt, and irrigation water goes. Soils, as we talked about, sustain plant and animal life. And really the diversity and productivity of living soils really depends, or the productivity of living things depends on soil and what's going on in the soil. Soils help to filter potential pollutants. So this happens through, as I mentioned before, soils have living things inside of them as one of the components. So those living materials, or sorry, those living organisms are responsible for a lot. And most importantly, they filter and detoxify organic and inorganic materials, including industrial and municipal byproducts and atmospheric deposits. So we're going to talk a lot more about what the living organisms do in our soils, because that's really important to us as gardeners, because they have other roles besides what I just mentioned. Soils are responsible for cycling nutrients. So all the nutrients that plants need, including carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, and many other nutrients, are stored and transformed and cycled through the soil. And as we already talked about, soil structure provides a medium for plant roots, but not just plants. Soil provide structure for what we build on them as well, including, our houses, roads, buildings. All of that really depends on soil. So a lot happening. When we think about, so I want to go over this because it's really important to understand just the basics of how soils are formed. So then we can start to think about how we can begin to amend them. There are 5 factors to soil formation: parent materials, climate, organisms, so living organisms, topography, and time. So parent material is very important, and it's going to affect the color of our soil, how permeable the soil is, so the rate at which water moves through the soil, and the pH. So we'll talk about pH in this class. So the parent material. In northern Arizona, common parent materials include basalt, limestone, shale, and in Page, you guys are on top of sandstone. So that's your parent material up there in Page. Climate. So think about Page's climate. It's very, very dry. So there's a lack of rainfall, and it gets pretty hot in the summer. So climate is really, really affects the rate of how soil is created. So living organisms are all throughout the soil, and this includes decomposing vegetation, microbes, so microorganisms, including fungi, bacteria, nematodes. There are a lot of creatures in the soil. And human beings actually can affect soil formation because we can highly compact soils, especially when we're doing projects where we're building and bringing in heavy machinery. So topography, we can just think of hills and mountains, and just the surrounding topography is really going to affect the development of soils. And areas that are flat, like in the Midwest, where glaciers have gone through, are going to have deeper soils. And then time. So time is the last of the 5 factors, and time is really influences how long the parent materials are subjected to soil formation processes. So here in the West, with our really arid climate, it takes a really long time for things to break down. So here's another diagram of the 5 soil components, and hopefully you can all see this. It's kind of hidden on my screen, but I don't think it's going to be on yours. So here are the 5 major components of soils in a diagram. So the mineral, when we talk about mineral particles, here we have sand, silt, and clay. So the sand is going to be the biggest particles, and that is what the gray area is. Clay is smaller, so that's the black. And then silt is the brown areas. We also have water and pore space that make up they're each one of the 5 components. And soil organic matter is carbon-based, and that is represented here in this brown area right here. And then microorganisms. So those microorganisms live off of the organic matter in the soil, and they include earthworms, fungi, bacteria, nematodes, and then there are a few others. So I'm just to make sure I didn't miss anything and from my notes on that. So here's just another diagram of the way that we can look at the 5 components of soil. So remember, the 5 components are mineral particles, water, air, organic matter, and microorganisms. So a healthy soil is going to have about 50% of our mineral particles. So that's the biggest piece of this pie chart right here. And then typically there's about 25% made up of air, 25% made up of water, and that's just looking at those pore spaces again. And then 2% organic matter is typically what we see in northern Arizona, but that number, depending on where you are, can get pretty high. It can go up to anywhere from 0 to 25% or more in an area that has a richer soil. But here in northern Arizona, we are looking at about 0 to 2% organic matter. So this represents northern Arizona. So this is a really important factor right here, is this for us gardening in northern Arizona, is this lack of organic matter. So what is soil organic matter? Sometimes, so when I say organic matter or soil or organic matter, it's interchangeable in this talk. And sometimes you'll see it if you're reading a book, you'll see it as SOM abbreviated or OM. So soil organic matter is really, really important in the soil because it does a whole heck of a lot. So it adds soil structure. It helps to reduce soil compaction. So I already mentioned that our soils can get heavily compacted, especially when there's construction going on and there's heavy equipment involved. Soil organic matter is going to increase water infiltration and water holding capacity in the soil. So we want both of those happening in the soil. We want the water to drain out, but we also want soils to hold on to the water to make it available for the plants. So adding organic matter to your soil is going to be really, really important for those of you. I mean, it's important for everybody in northern Arizona, but especially for you guys up in Page who are pretty much gardening in sand. As I mentioned before, think of soil as a living system. There's a lot of microbes and just other living organisms in the soil, and adding organic matter into your soil is really going to help those microbes out. Organic matter can provide a source of nutrients for your plants, and it helps keep some of those nutrients available for your plants. So we'll talk more about nutrient availability in plants later on in this talk. And just keep in mind, we see this a lot, especially when you're adding organic matter to raised beds year after year after year. It gets to a point where you're gardening in nothing but organic matter, and then you're missing out on that mineral component that we talked about. That's part of the native soil. So then your plants will kind of they can start to suffer. So just remember, too much organic matter isn't always good. One downfall of soil organic matter is that it can retain pesticides longer in your soil. So here's a map of the US, and this map illustrates the soil organic matter, the differences of organic matter found naturally in your soils across the US. So over here, where it's really, really dark in the Midwestern area, that's some pretty fertile soil that's high in organic matter. But if we look over here where we are, up in northern Arizona, and you look at this graph down here, we have very, very low organic matter in our soil, 0 to 2%. So that leads us to our first problem when it comes to soils. when we're trying to grow vegetables in northern Arizona. So we have low soil organic matter, so we need to add amendments to our soil. So how do we do that? Well, the best thing for you to do when you're gardening in sandy soils is to add well composted materials to your soil. And this could be a garden compost that you, and I guess I should mention too, the second half of this talk is all about compost. So we'll talk about how you can make your own garden compost at home, but that's going to be a really, really helpful amendment for you to add into your soils. And Paige, and actually Jora, who's in the class, many of you probably know her. She lives in Paige. She just sent me a photo. There's somebody in Fredonia who has loads and loads of organic compost that she went and picked up. The price was relative. It was a good price. I can't remember what it was, but maybe if you see her, ask her about it. I should have put a picture of the Facebook post in the slide, but just know that that's an option, or you can make your own. And we're going to talk about how you can do that in this class. Composted manures. So composted is the main adjective here. So adding composted manures to your soil is going to be really beneficial. You can buy mushroom compost in bags. We've used that at the extension office and it works pretty good. There is a lot of peat moss in there, but also there is the mushroom compost. And then green manures are also a way that you can add organic material into your soil. But the way that those work is that they are crops that are grown and then they're tilled in the spring. So you can think of them as like a cover crop. So we grew a couple of different cover crops in our demonstration garden at the extension office. One of them was in the pea family, so that's really good for fixing nitrogen into the soil. And then we did one bed that was, we experimented with an edible cover crop. So we ate some of the lettuce, greens as they were growing over the winter. And then in the spring, we turned both of those crops into the soil. So that's adding organic matter into your soil. And so that's what a green manure is. So why wouldn't you want to add just straight up woody materials like sawdust or wood chips into your soil as an organic matter? Well, these materials are really, really high in carbon. So we're going to have to learn about the carbon to nitrogen ratio and how much carbon there is to nitrogen in some of our materials that we're adding into our soil. So anything that's woody, that's really, really high in carbon, and we're going to look at some examples of carbon and nitrogen ratios and some products. So anything that's really, really high in carbon, like the woody materials or sawdust, is going to take a lot of nitrogen to break down that carbon. And what that's going to do is take nitrogen away from your plants. So when you're adding organic matter into your soil, and so think about the carbon to nitrogen ratio. The optimal carbon to nitrogen ratio in soil, just in general, is 25:1. So anything that has a ratio greater than 25:1 requires adding additional nitrogen in order for those high carbon woody materials to break down. So here's a chart. If you want to learn more about carbon to nitrogen ratios, there's tons of information out there online, but I just, for the sake of time, pulled a few examples off of the internet and threw them into a table. And this is just a general carbon to nitrogen ratio. So most vegetable wastes have a lower carbon to nitrogen ratio. So 12 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen to 20% or 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. So those are like your vegetable waste, like your greens. So we can think of those as our greens when we're adding organic materials into our soils. Grass clippings also have a pretty low carbon to nitrogen ratio. So that just means that they're higher. There's more nitrogen content in these materials. Cow manure is 20 to 1. Horse manure, so here we got our ideal right here, 25 to 1. But then when we start getting into leaves and straw and bark and just more woody materials, those carbon to nitrogen ratios really, they skyrocket. So like look at bark, paper, wood chips, and sawdust. I mean, this is huge. Like it potentially could be 500 to 1. So what that's going to do is one, in our arid environment, if you're adding that type of material into your soil without any other nitrogen materials, your green materials like your vegetable waste and your grass clippings, that is never going to break down. Number one, it's going to take forever, and especially in our arid, dry environment. But then also the microorganisms that are in your soil that break that material down are going to use nitrogen as well to break down those materials. So that's why you need to add nitrogen to help break down these really high carbon to nitrogen ratio materials. And when we talk about composting, I'm going to give you a really simple formula to remember how much carbon to how much nitrogen, because it can get pretty complicated when you're trying to figure out recipes for composting. So when you're managing your organic amendments, just remember that high carbon to nitrogen ratio organics are going to add adequate nitrogen during soil application. So you're going to have to add nitrogen when you're using those high carbon products. Or what you can do first, before you add it to your soil, is to just compost it. So this is going to help reduce that high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And then another benefit of composting your materials before you just add them directly into your soil is that it's going to eliminate pathogens and weed seeds and other potentially harmful materials that could be in whatever you're adding to your soil as your organic amendment. When we look at the low carbon to nitrogen ratio organics, so that's more like your green material. So your veggie scraps, your grass clippings, if anybody still has lawns up in Page. I know they're slowly going away down here in Flagstaff. When you add those directly to the soil, you're going to have to watch for burning. So as Danielle mentioned a couple of weeks ago, you're going to want to avoid adding things that have really high nitrogen content before they're composted down, because you run the risk of burning your plants. When we're adding organic amendments into the soil, it's ideal if you can spread at least 4 inches of organic material to the top of your soil, and then dig it in as deep as you can. 18 inches is the best, but some folks might not even have 18 inches. And we see that a lot in Flagstaff because a lot of times we're just gardening on rocks. And I gather that some of you have deeper soils and some might have really shallow soils up there in Page. So do your best to dig it in 18 inches down. And as I mentioned last week, if you can't do that, then sometimes it's better to just build up. When do you add organic material? Well, you're going to want to add it every single year. We'll look at another slide that has kind of a time. We'll look at it seasonally and figure out when you can add soil in the, gosh, I just totally lost my train of thought. So the next slide that we're going to look at is going to show you when to add organic materials and what kind of organic materials to add depending on what season it is. But remember that you can add too much, and this happens a lot when we're gardening in raised beds. At some point, you're going to have just organic matter in your raised bed, and you're going to be missing out on that really important mineral component of our organic soils.
Question on digging it in.
Yes.
So I've kind of evolved to doing that when you first start a bed to do a real deep dig in. But then I've also read that after that, you don't want to do as much soil disturbance, and you just keep adding the organic material just more on the top rather than trying to dig real deep every single year. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I think that if you've got it really, really deep for the first time when you're first amending your soil, so you're adding in a brand new garden, that 18 inches is going to be really important for you. But like you were saying, year after year, you might not need to go that deep, because it's a lot of work. I mean, it's a ton of work, especially if you're doing it by hand. There's also a few techniques you could look up double digging. A lot of people around here will do that as well when they're adding amendments into your soil, and that doesn't do as much disturbance as digging down 18 inches every year will do.
Can I just ask you a question? When you mentioned grass clippings, can that go in like as you cut it, or do you need to compost it first?
Well, if you're going to put those in, you should compost them first. I mean, that's going to be the best thing for you guys to do up there in those sandy soils. Just add them as part of your compost and compost them completely, all of your organic materials, and then you can add that in the spring. But if that's not really an option for you, then you can add that in the fall, and then just kind of let that compost over the winter naturally in your garden bed. But adding that carbon is going to be really beneficial as well. So if you're adding any materials that are not composted, you're going to want to add them in the fall. If you add stuff like that high nitrogen content green grass clippings into your soil in the spring right before you're going to plant, you run the risk of burning your crops because it'll be just too much nitrogen in the soil.
I have a quick question, if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
So you said to watch over the years, not to have too much organic material. Mm-hmm. So would you then add more native soil back in?
Yeah, I would try to do that, or those recipes that I showed you all last week. just adding other materials like, I can't remember them offhand. There are a couple of them. One of them was sand, compost, and garden, your native soil, which you guys are in super sandy soil already. So I don't see why you would have to add more sand to sand. You know, in Flagstaff, we're pretty lucky because we have a landscape company where we can go and buy native soil, or topsoil that's been composted with the mule manure from Grand Canyon. So we have that option. So that would be something that we would add here. You can get bags of topsoil. A lot of times in like the hardware store or at Walmart. So that would be a really good additive to add as well, because it will have that mineral component to it. So most
sorry.
oh yeah, go ahead.
So with the horse manure being 25:1, it's still like a 6-month breakdown time, right? Like you would want to put it in the fall and then winter it over. Even
Yeah, because it could still, like if you put that hot poo that's not composted down, it could right in your garden in the spring, it could burn your plants still.
Okay. And I put the Fredonia info in the chat.
Oh, good. So my next bullet point is that the most garden and landscape plants perform best when the soil organic matter level is at 2%, at least 2%. And you know, we have 0 to 2% here, but the goal for vegetable and flower beds should be around 5%. So no matter what, we're gonna have to add soil organic matter to our soils. And then the organic matter also helps with soil structure, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in the next couple of slides. So here's that soil cycle that I was telling you about. This came from one of our master gardeners in Flagstaff. This is just kind of like a really good flow chart that he uses. He always says that the best time to add your organic matter into your soil is in the fall. But I would say that the spring is just as good of a job. But just make sure that you're adding those composted materials into your soil in the spring. So he looks at it as a cycle. So in the fall, you're adding compost and your other organic material, whatever you have on hand, into your soil. And in the wintertime, then your soil's kind of just resting. But you could also plant a cover crop. I mean, you guys, especially in Page, it definitely doesn't get as cold as it does in Flagstaff. But you could plant a cover crop, and then you could have your green, it breaking down, and then your green manure that you're turning in to the soil. And then in the spring, he usually adds sulfur and a balanced fertilizer in the spring, and then he tills it in, and then he plants his plants. And then depending on what you're growing, we looked at fertilizers last week. It'll just depend on what you're growing. So if you're growing tomatoes, you can get a product that's specifically for tomatoes, and then it'll have instructions on when to add that. So just fertilize as needed, and then after you're done, you harvest, and then you clean up your garden, and then it starts all over again. Okay, so soil texture is another component of our native soils that is going to be really important to understand, because it's also going to influence a lot of components in your garden. So the soil texture is just the amount of sand, silt, and clay that's in the soil. So when we look at the soil particles here individually, and we kind of already looked at this with that diagram with like the gray representing the sand, and then the brown representing silt, and then the black representing clay. But what's important to know, so when we're testing for soil texture, we're looking at the amount of sand, silt, and clay in the soil. So, and that excludes all of the organic matter. So when you're testing for this in your yard, you want to pull out like any cobble or little pebbles or any extra organic matter that might be found in there. So sand, so here's the important part. Sand has the biggest size particles. Silt is smaller than sand, but it's bigger than clay. So clay is made up of really teeny tiny particles. So you guys are dealing with sand, right? So that particle size, is big. There we go. And then the way that we test this, we're not going to go over this, but you can do a really simple soil texture by field test, and you basically just get soil from your yard, you dig down, you put it in your hand, you wet it, and then you make a ball, and then you try to make a ribbon. And if the ribbon is gets really long, then you have essentially a lot of clay in your soil. But if it doesn't even form a ball, which yours probably wouldn't in Page, then you're dealing with a lot of sand. So this is the USDA soil texture triangle. And this is another way that you could test your soil at home. You could do this with a simple jar test. If you want to learn more about that, just Google that soil jar test online. It's really easy to do. It's kind of fun. But the reason why I wanted to show this to you is because when we're, as gardeners, the texture that we're going for is loam. So loam is like the most ideal texture for gardening. And when we're adding our organic materials into our soil, we're kind of trying to aim for that loamy texture. So here's sand down here. If you guys did the test, you probably would land somewhere down here. But loam is every gardener's dream, and that's made up of 40% sand, 40% silt, and 20% clay. So that brings us to your other problem in Page, is that you are pretty much gardening in sand. So particle size matters. And that's because it's really going to affect watering for you, and the way that the water either gets held in the soil or the way that it moves through the soil. So water molecules hold more tightly in the fine clay particles. So you can see here's a picture of a drip emitter, and just see how the water moves through the soil here in the clay. And then when we look at sand, it is just going to filter straight down. So adding that organic material into your native soil is really going to help you retain some of that water that you're putting on your plants. So that's another reason why it's really important to add organic matter into your soil. Also, the nutrient holding capacity is really low in sandy soil. So a lot of that just kind of flushes the nutrients that your plants need, just kind of flushes down through the soil, and adding organic matter is also going to help you with that. So just remember that more frequent irrigation and fertilizing is going to need to happen in sandy soils. So adding organic material is going to be really, really important for you all gardening in sand. So soil depth is also really important because this is going to allow for healthy plant growth as far as the roots are able to move down into the soil. So when we look at soil depths, very shallow soils are less than 10 inches. Shallow soils are 10 to 20 inches deep. We've got moderately deep, 20 to 36 inches, and deep, what we call deep is 36 to 60 inches, and then very deep is deeper than 60 inches. And so I was really curious about the soil depth of page. So I pulled up this diagram. This is from the NRCS Soil Web Survey website, and how they got this information is that people went out and did many soil surveys over the years, and I wanted to learn more about what you guys are gardening on in page. So you can see here, so here number 49, so this is like on the rim over here. You've got very shallow soils is what they're classifying your depth as, and then your texture is loamy sand. So number 44 was also in town. This is kind of like off the mesa right here, and the depth class here was very, very deep. And so I think that this is, I don't know Paige as well as you guys do, but I think this is like Hall Road is over here. And then also it was like the downtown area had that kind of same very deep sandy soils. And I'm just curious if you guys who live there think that is this what you experience? I mean, things do change because, you know, construction happens, but anyway, so number 32, which is over here by the airport, it had the depth class is moderately deep, and then the texture is loamy sand. So I don't know if that's really what you're experiencing, but that's what the Soil Web Survey says. So let's move on to pH. And pH is something that's also really important to understand as a gardener. So we express the acidity or alkalinity. We call alkalinity is also called basic of in pH units. So here's the scale right here, and it runs from 0 to 14. And things that are over here below 7 are considered acidic, and then alkaline is above 7, and that goes up to 14. And then what we call neutral is right here on the at number 7. So plants typically grow within this range right here between 4 and 10. But what we need to understand about pH in Western soils is that we have pretty alkaline soils here in the arid West. So that's really going to affect the way that our native plants, right, they're adapted to that. But our vegetable crops are not. So the ideal pH in order for plants to maximize the nutrient uptake in a plant is around 6.5 to 6.8 is the optimum range, but it falls into this range right here. And then our native soils are pretty alkaline, so that can really affect the nutrient availability for our plants. So here's just kind of another way to break down the pH scale with items that you're familiar with at home. So things that are really acidic would be batteries and tomatoes. Water has typically like around a neutral pH. And then alkaline materials would be bleach and drain cleaners. So as I mentioned before, pH can really affect the nutrient availability for our plants, and the ideal range is around here in this 6.5 area. So we're going to talk a whole lot about plant problems with Hattie, but here's just a couple of slides that can show you some deficiencies in your soil that will, here's just a couple of ways that we can kind of troubleshoot what's going around or going wrong in our soils by looking at our plants. But I'm going to tell you right now, this is really hard to do. It's not this simple. So trying to determine your plant deficiencies by looking at your plants can be really hard, and it stumps plant pathologists a lot. So the best thing that you can do is get your soil tested, and we'll talk about that a little later. But remember from our kindergarten fertilizer talk last week, if your plants are experiencing slow growth, it could be a nitrogen deficiency in your soil. If you're seeing poor bloom or fruit production, it could be phosphorus, and stunted growth, it could be potassium. So, I mean, you can look at the leaves for more clues, but a lot of these signs and symptoms kind of overlap. So it's not going to definitely tell you what's wrong with your plants, but a lot of times with potassium deficiencies, we'll see leaf tips and margin kind of burn. So like yellowing, browning around the edges of the leaves. Phosphorus, we'll kind of see this dark green and purplish foliage up here. Here's the potassium deficiency. And then nitrogen, the mature leaves will start to change yellow before the newer leaves. So just, it's very difficult to try to determine what's going on by your plants, but I mean, sometimes you can take a stab at it. Just remember that in our dry climate and our alkaline soils, they typically lose nitrogen quickly. So basically, a lot of times that's the #1 problem that we're dealing with here. There seems to be enough potassium in the soil, but if you are working in sandy soils and new gardens that are low in organic matter, sometimes you'll see problems with potassium. So that could be your third problem is, you know, nutrients. Your nutrients could be off, and your pH could not be right for growing vegetables. So really the way that you're going to determine what's going on is to send in a soil test, and I'm going to give you a couple of resources for that. But these labs, unfortunately we don't do it at the extension office, but we can make some recommendations where you can send your soil. You can get a lot of really useful information out of that, including all of these available nutrients. And then they also will test for micronutrients. And then you can get some soil properties results, which would include texture, and then the pH, which is going to be really important. So Peaceful Valley Farm Supply, that's in California. This is probably one of our favorite places to recommend, but we can't recommend just one. So we've got the University of Massachusetts, and then Texas A&M University. But this Peaceful Valley Farm Supply is relatively inexpensive. You can get your soil tested, I think, for 30 or 40 bucks, and it's just in California, so it's relatively close. So that concludes our soil portion. So hopefully you just have a better understanding of, you know, what makes up a soil, and what you guys are dealing with up in Page, and then how you can fix those problems. So we're going to wrap up with backyard composting. And here we're going to talk about how you can make that organic matter at home to amend your soils. And composting really is probably one of the best things that compost is probably one of the best things that you can add to your soil as a home garden. So what is composting? So composting is a natural process. This is the technical definition. The natural process of recycling organic matter, such as leaves and food scraps, into a valuable fertilizer that can enrich soil and plants. Composting has a lot of really, really great benefits. So as we talked about already, it enriches the soil. It helps to retain that moisture, especially in your sandy soils. And it will help suppress plant diseases and pests. It reduces the need for chemical fertilizers. So typically, if you're adding compost into your soils, you really only need to do minor supplemental fertilizing throughout the year. And it encourages the production of beneficial bacteria and fungi. So those microorganisms that are already naturally found in your soil, it really helps them break down that organic matter to create humus, which is a rich nutrient-filled material. And we don't really have humus found naturally here, especially you guys in Page, but in really thick forests, you can find humus. Sometimes you'll see it as an amendment in your some of the material that you can buy at the nursery, like in your potting soils, you'll see humus. Compost, another really great benefit of compost is that it reduces waste from going into the landfill. And composting is fun. It's a lot of work, but it's really, really exciting when you get that end result. So there are a few factors that you really need to think about for successful composting. Just remember that composting is a process, and it really takes work. And if you don't do the steps that we're going to talk about in this talk, you are mostly just rotting your materials. So for successful composting, you're going to have a good system or a method. You need mass. So that's your materials. You want to have a lot of mass in your pile because it's going to help break it down faster. Your organic material that you're adding. So here we are again with the carbon and nitrogen ratio. Heat is going to be crucial. So is oxygen. Particle size of your material that you're adding is really important. So you are going to want to, and as opposed to throwing an entire rotten onion or melon directly into your compost that you didn't unfortunately have the chance to eat, make sure that you break that down. It does take a little bit of work up front, but it's going to be worth it to your compost pile in the end. Microorganisms are really, really important for successful composting, and so is adding water. So first, we're going to talk about your system. Unfortunately, I don't have any really cool pictures of some systems that you guys have in Page, but here's a really great 3-bin system from the Museum of Northern Arizona. And this is where they first add their materials. So they're greens and they're brown. So they're nitrogen and carbon. And then when that starts breaking down, they will put it into the next bin. And then finally, when it's about to finish, they'll have it in this 3rd bin right here. Here's some, and this is just handmade, pretty easy to make if you're lucky enough to have those skills. Or if you don't have those skills, you can buy something like this. We used to give these away at in the city of or sell them. They can be quite expensive in Flagstaff, and this is called an earth machine. And this is really cool because you just you add your materials into this compost bin, and then you just pick the bin up, and then you set it down, and then you shovel it back into the earth machine. So then you're turning your compost pile and you're adding that oxygen into it. So turning your compost is really important. These little tumblers, this is where you can add your material and then they spin, and that's one way of turning your compost. One good thing I think about these is that it keeps the rodents out, but really I think that that's the only good thing about these. I know that Alyssa also had one of these systems. I have one at home, and I wish that I did not waste my money on it. It's kind of small. The ideal size that you need for your compost, I think it's on the slide, is, I didn't mention it, is 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet. That's what you're going for. That's why these systems are nice, because they're big enough, and you're going to be able to provide that mass for you in order for your pile to break down. These, I mean, they probably are 3 feet by 3 feet by 3 feet, but a lot of things, like for me, I experience they never get warm enough. It's hard to turn even when you're tumbling it. I still have to get in there with a hand trowel and mix things together, and it was expensive. It was like $200. Alyssa told me that she put hers in a yard sale in Page, and I think that's where mine's destined to end up this year in Flagstaff. So here's a couple of other systems that you can do. These have the nice bigger sizes. So this is just some pallets put together so you can reuse these materials. This is just like some wire caging there. This is something that we had at Yavapai College, and this was we had a really big system. This is just made out, looks like maybe cinder blocks or something, but the point is that we could get in there with a tractor, with a shovel on the front, and then turn our compost that way. But we had a really big operation. Another thing to think about with your system is what are you going to collect your kitchen scraps in? So you can, if you have a big family, or many years ago, I worked at Phantom Ranch at the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and we, instead of sending all of our food scraps out on the mules, we had a composting system down there. And when you were the cook, you just put all of your kitchen scraps in a 5-gallon bucket. Some river companies are doing this now, bringing some of the food scraps from the river and then taking them to actually the Museum of Northern Arizona for their composting system. Or if you're just, it's just me and my boyfriend. So I bought this cute little thing that sits on my countertop from World Market. Or here's just a Folgers can picture down here. So that's a reusable items. So what do we compost and what do we not compost? So here's some compostable materials: fruits and vegetables, eggshells, coffee grounds, tea bags, nutshells, newspaper, cardboard, paper, yard trimming. So, I mean, the list goes on and on. You can Google what materials are acceptable to compost. There's a lot of really great information out there. So I just wanted to throw out a few items here, but you can do your own research. What not to compost is going to be really important. So you want to avoid adding coal or charcoal ash. We get questions about this because a lot of times those coals are treated with like lighter fluid or other substances that can be harmful to your plants. Avoid composting dairy products, so like butter, milk, sour cream, yogurt, and raw eggs. The shells are okay. A lot of problems can happen here. It can start to get really stinky and start to attract your pests like rodents and flies, so you want to avoid that. Disease or insect-ridden plants. So if you have a plant that has a problem that you've identified, or an insect infestation, or a weed that's in seed, I would avoid composting those, because if you're not composting right, you don't get your temperatures high enough, all of those pathogens and seeds could survive the composting process and then get transferred back into your garden. So avoid that. And then fats, grease, lard, or oils. Again, this kind of is the same reason why we don't compost dairy. It's stinky and it can attract pests and flies. You want to avoid putting meat or fish bones and scraps in your pile. Again, the odor problems, pet waste. A lot of nasty things can live in your dog or cat feces. So you don't want to put that into your compost, because you could be introducing parasites and bacteria, viruses, other pathogens that could be harmful to you into your garden. And watch for yard trimmings that are treated with chemical pesticides. So here we are again with the carbon to nitrogen ratio. So simply put, our browns are our products that are high in carbon, and our greens are our nitrogen containing things that we're adding to our compost. So browns could be dry leaves, wood chips, straw, sawdust, corn stalks, newspaper. So those all have a high carbon to nitrogen ratio. And the greens are higher in nitrogen. So your greens, like your food scraps, grass clippings, manure that hasn't been composted, and pulled weeds. So when we're composting, now here's this graph again. So remember that the anything that is high in nitrogen is going to have that carbon to nitrogen ratio that's less than 30:1. And a high carbon is going to be greater than 30:1. And there are a lot of recipes that are out there in order to get this exactly right for your compost, but we don't have time to go over that. So I have it simply put here for you, and this is totally okay. You don't need a really scientific recipe for composting. It will help you be a little more efficient, but just remember 2 to 4 parts brown to 1 part green, and you should be good. So that's because, you know, all of the things that are happening in your compost pile, there's a lot going on. So the carbon is going to provide energy, food for the microorganisms in your compost pile that are helping you to break down those materials. And then the nitrogen materials provide the protein that the microorganisms need in order to break down the carbon food. So basically put, the carbon materials are the food for your microorganisms that are doing all the work in your compost. Well, you're doing work too, because you need to turn it and add water to it. We'll talk about that. And then the nitrogen materials are the digestive enzymes. So there's a lot happening, and that's why during the breaking down process, and that's why it's really important to understand that you need to have so much brown material to so much green material. So 2 to 4 parts brown to 1 part green. So microorganisms, water, heat, and oxygen are all very important parts of the process. So we've got our system, we've got our materials, and then here are other things that are really going to help us be successful with our composting. So as I mentioned before, the microbes are really, really hard at work in your compost. They're doing a lot for you in there. So you don't want your compost to dry out. So water is going to be really important because it's going to support that microbial life in the pile. So Your compost should be 50 to 60% moisture. And that's just going to feel like a damp sponge. So if you pick up your compost, especially when it's finishing, if you're wringing it out, there's too much water in there. So you just want it to feel like a damp sponge. So if you add too much water, then you're taking away, you're kind of creating an anaerobic situation that's going to get really stinky, and then that's not going to help those microorganisms either. So especially another thing to think about, especially in our dry climate, not enough water in the pile it won't help your pile to break down. So if it's really, really dry, nothing's going to happen. It's just going to kind of sit there. So water is really important. So our little buddies, the microbes, they need oxygen to function. So the way that we add oxygen is by turning your pile. So, you know, you have a college, we have the tractor with the big shovel on the front. You could get one of those earth machines where you're just picking it up, and then you're turning your pile by shoveling all of your material back in there. Or you could do something like that 3-bin system where you're, you know, moving your stuff from one bin to the other as the composting pile progresses. So all of that is considered turning your pile. If you turn your pile, the more you turn your pile, so once every 3-7 days, it's going to break down faster. I am a very lazy composter, I will admit it, even in my silly little tumbler, but you know, it's really going to help you be successful and hurry the process, because things happen really slowly here. They do not compost nearly as fast as they do in wetter climates. So just it's going to take some more work in order for it to break down faster. So the more you turn it, the sooner it'll be ready. And keep your pile cooking. This is where that mass is critical. So the more stuff you have in your pile, the more it's breaking down and the more it's cooking. So all of that stuff is happening. It's actively decomposing. So this is really, really important part of composting. You have to have it up to the ideal temperature. This is going to help the composting process and the decomposition happen. And then also this is where you're going to be killing your pathogens and your weed seeds, if there are any in there. The ideal temperature is 104 to 150 degrees. You can get a thermometer and just stick it in there and try to get it in the center of your pile. And they're pretty easy to find. We have one at the office that's probably about this big. It's got a bigger dial on it for us to read, and then we're definitely checking the temperature of our compost. So if you manage your pile well, it'll continue to cook even in the winter time. So you can, you know, it gets very cold in Page too. And, you know, we get a lot of questions. Hey, can we compost during the winter? And absolutely, your pile is still actively composting. We've had big snowstorms in Flagstaff and gone out and checked our composting pile, and it's steaming. Yeah, and there are things that you can also do to help the cooking process in the wintertime. One of our master gardeners adds hot water in the wintertime to kind of help that process along. So with composting, you can, there's some potential problems. So if you have a pile that has a really strong ammonia smell, it could have too much nitrogen. So to remedy that, you add more carbon. So too much nitrogen would be too much of the greens. So add more brown. And there's a pretty funny typo there. I meant to say turn your pile, not turn your bile. So if it's smelling like ammonia, another thing that you can do is to turn your pile. If your pile is not breaking down and it's kind of just sitting there, you might have too much of that brown, so too much carbon. one way to remedy that is to add more green material. It could also be too dry. So I'm also very guilty of this. I kind of forget about my pile in the winter and it just dries out super fast, even in the winter, especially in that tumbler. So if it's not breaking down and it just kind of sitting there, you might need to add some water. In the winter, here's some tips. I kind of talked about some, but you're going to want, so this came from a master gardener in Flagstaff who's really, really great at composting. He actually cracked the code for composting pine needles, which is a really big deal for us in the Ponderosa pine forest. But some of his winter tips I thought I'd share with you guys because it does get cold there in Page. In the winter, he likes to add some hotter green materials. And this includes that manure, alfalfa grains, and blood meal. He suggests making sure your pile is in a sunny spot and your pile will stay warmer on the ground. So that's another downfall of those tumblers. They're up off the ground. You can double cover your pile with a tarp and add warm water, as I mentioned before, and then just put in some elbow grease. So turn your pile often. So the finished product is really, really exciting to get. I have gotten finished compost even in my little tumbler. How do you know when it's done? Well, the compost pile is going to shrink down to half its size and it's going to be cool. So it'll be around air temperature. It'll be really nice and dark and crumbly. And most of the original materials are going to be unrecognizable because they've broken down. And it's got a, believe it or not, finished compost smells sweet. And you can test it by putting it in a Ziploc bag and then sealing it and then smelling it 1 week. If it has kind of a sweet smell to it, then you've got yourself a good product. One other part of the finishing process is to screen your large materials out. So here's a screen that it looks like maybe this one was handmade and it's like wood, a square frame, and then it's got the screen on top, and then you just get all of your material out of your pile and rub it through, and then that should get all of that big stuff out. So then you're not spreading that into your garden. And then you get this really nice, lovely finished product down here. And you can buy composting screens as well for those of you who have the money and you don't have the time or the talent to build something like that. And then it's ready to spread in your garden. So you can amend your soil with it in the spring or in the fall. So my tumbler is pretty small, so I need to use my compost in the summer. So I've top dressed my plants with compost, and that will serve as a mulch to kind of help keep the moisture in the soil. And then also you're adding the nutrients and all that good stuff that's in the compost back into the soil. So that is it. We still have some time left. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen so I can see everybody. And then if you have any questions,